Good afternoon. This is another one of these, whatever this might be. Linux these days has gotten a delightful upturn in usage, and a lot of people are trying it out for the first time. That is fantastic, and it's been super interesting as a non-developer open source aficionado to follow how people have tackled getting to know the new system out for the first time. There's some super interesting and brilliant videos out there, but I've also noticed that some common things that people who try it out have gotten stumbled by. Now, I'm not going to highlight any channels or videos unless I have some positive things to say about them. Negativity is being dished out quite enough on this platform as it is, so there is absolutely no reason to add on to it. But there are some annoyances that I've noticed, and hopefully by highlighting them I can shed light on how to avoid them and how to make the transition smoother for other new users. Now, a lot of these traps I've fallen into myself. Some others I'm still guilty of. I am not a computer scientist. I don't know how to code. I don't have much understanding about the kernel works, and I mainly just follow tutorials to get around. In other words, I'm knowledgeable enough to be dangerous, but not enough to be fully effective. I think that might describe a lot of us. So, here we go. Number 1. Linux is not a free Windows. Linux is a completely different operating system with its own perks, peculiarities, and usage philosophies. A lot of the people I find struggling with how to adapt to it are people who try to force their Windows workflows as is to this completely different platform and then get really annoyed when it doesn't work quite the same. This is also a common thing when people move from proprietary software like Photoshop to an open source one like GIMP. In a way, this is understandable. I wouldn't want my entire workflow to go all awry myself. But have you noticed that for a lot of people, this does not apply when they move from proprietary system to another proprietary system? People who move from Windows to Mac OS or vice versa don't expect things to work exactly the same. People who move from Adobe Premiere to DaVinci Resolve don't usually expect things to be exactly the same either. Instead, it is expected for there to be a whole crossover period where you need to familiarize yourself with the new system. macOS and Windows don't even share the same modifier key for the most common shortcuts, and I really don't see people complaining about that. But for some reason, this same logic does not seem to apply to a lot of folks, even computer literate folks, when moving from a proprietary system to an open source one. I don't know if it has something to do with the stigma of an open source, freely distributed system being inherently less than a proprietary paid-for product. Some of this is historical baggage, as only 15 to 20 years ago, Linux and open source tools were a lot rougher. But things have moved on, and open source systems power most of the high-performance workloads in the world. This brings me to the subsection which probably annoys me the most, and it comes up over and over again. 1.5. Linux is only free if you don't value your time. What? Where was this magical unicorn that gave you instantaneous knowledge of proprietary systems so that you never had to learn them? And if you can find it, can you ask it to teach me how to write C code? I need a job. In fact, I'd argue that it probably took you more time to learn Windows or Mac OS because you learned them while you were learning what these peculiar computer machines might be. You have a massive leg up on your younger self in that you already know how to work a computer and how to read a modern computer interface. In addition, you're probably older, so you have more sense than you did as a kid. Good job for not dying before you got here. Now I get it. The point is more about how you already know these systems because you learned them as a kid, and now it takes more away from the rest of your life as a busy older person to learn and adapt to a new one. But my point is, Just because you've already spent time learning another system doesn't mean that you didn't spend that time. It's a sunk cost fallacy if I've ever heard one. And again, one that I rarely hear when moving from a proprietary system to another. But yeah, I get it. You're busy now, you weren't in the past. But what I can't really understand is when people say, I'm installing Windows just because I want something that just works. Bruh, have you met Windows? Just because you're familiar with the quirks doesn't mean that they don't cost you a lot of time. Sometimes it goes as far as people saying that and then recommending a Windows 11 deep loader so that they can strip away the ads, the forced bloatware, the AI things they're force feeding you, and worst of all, recall. And when you have an update, it'll randomly restart your system and hangs at 30% done for whoever knows how long. But don't worry, that time was valuable. Microsoft owns it and is making a bundle of money selling your data to the highest bidder. Number 2, Distro is not the same as the user interface. This is Linux Mint. And 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 okay, this is Arch, but you get my drift. This is one that I fell a victim to for the longest time and is one of the largest paradigm shifts when moving from Windows or macOS to Linux or any other open source operating system. Both of those systems come with a singular user interface that is monolith, and there's only so much you can do to change or modify it. On Linux systems, instead, you get to choose from a wide plethora of desktop environments, window managers, user interfaces, or just skip on the graphics altogether if you so choose. Most Linux operating systems do come with one or several user interfaces, so choosing the distribution will affect which of them will be the one you get presented with. But if you like the system otherwise but would rather use some UI you got familiar with in another, no problem. Just install another one and customize it to just the way you want. But this is one of those ones that I kind of get though. Sometimes installing desktop environments or window managers and getting them up and running can be of intermediate difficulty. That's why it's not wrong to base your initial choice on screenshots or recommendation based on what system you're migrating from. However, it is kind of funny how often distro reviews are actually desktop reviews because the review of the distro is entirely based on the default desktop environment. But I did that too, and for a beginner, it's fine. However, that brings me logically to my next point, which is number 3. Distro doesn't matter. There are thousands of different varieties and flavors of Linux out there, from the mainstream and corporate to the community-focused and hacky to the meme ones that even non-Linux users have often heard of. But at the end of the day, the vast majority of these distros are based on a few behemoth distros that create the basis around which to do subtle or major variations on. But even that doesn't matter, because in open source, pretty much all software is available for all distros. Yes, indeed, 99% of the time you can use whatever program you want on whichever distro you want. Therefore, it makes very little difference what system you are on, since the system is mainly there to support the programs you actually use to do the things you want to do. And if you are at the stage that you know and care about package repos and other distro-specific backend stuff, you already know everything that's covered in this video. You can click on to something else. Or comment on all the mistakes I made. Engagement. I'm baiting. YouTubing. It's easy to get bogged in the idea that a distro is what you see, is what you get, because that's what you're used to in Windows and Mac OS, because that's how it goes. But the big strength of open source operating systems is that you can customize it however you want. And therefore it really doesn't matter as much which distro of Linux you have set up at the base of it. But there's also a reason why distro hopping is a term. It's fun to try things out, and that's also a strength. Go nuts! You can run as many as you want, but the applications you use are most likely going to be identical and available for all of them just the same. Which brings us to number 4. Installing applications is confusing. This is another major paradigm shift that I totally get people need time to get used to. On Windows and macOS, you go to a website, get the installer, hope for the best, and there you go. But on Linux, things work a bit different, and mostly it's through application repositories. Therefore, you get all of them from the same source unless you really want to do something wild. In the past, this happened in the fabled and endlessly scary terminal, but no longer. Almost all beginner-friendly distributions come with their own visual application manager or an app store, where you just pick and choose what you want, and Bob is indeed your father's brother. I don't understand how, but to a lot of people this concept seems to include a lot of confusion, because this clearly is a thing we're completely alienated on, because nothing else uses an app store. In fact, Linux repositories preceded all this proprietary app store garbage with the added benefit that you don't need to pay for anything, and the free applications don't come with obnoxious video apps every time you dare breathe in. When I first got into Linux around 20 years ago, this approach to application management I found to be one of the big selling points, because I could manage all my software from a centralized place and not have to faff around with websites. And since the repositories are managed by the distribution maintainers, you don't have to worry about malicious software getting in there, because there's a whole community of people monitoring it. Of course, it can happen, and lately has been happening more, but unlike on Android or iOS, it's not the main revenue stream. So yeah, just try out software as much as you want. Install, uninstall, reinstall, go nuts! No terminal required. Number 5. You don't need to use the terminal. There is still this misconception that you need to be able to use the command line tools to run Linux, and this hasn't really been the case for over a decade. One of the big reasons people do think this is that the more seasoned Linux users amongst us are so used to it that they find it faster. Something that can take 7 mouse actions might be done with 1 line of commands on the terminal. But here's the dirty secret. It's exactly the same in Windows and macOS as well. Yeah, there's a terminal in macOS and 2 different command line interfaces in Windows. And some people prefer to use them over the graphical interface on those systems too. The only reason Linux has more of a reputation for it is that the user-friendly interfaces are a lot newer in Linux. But they are pretty darn mature by now. In many cases, they are even more mature than the commercial competitors, because again, the point is to give maximum control to the user rather than the company producing it. Is there a benefit to learning how to use it? Sure. Do I use it? Heck yeah. In fact, I'm so comfortable using it that none of my systems boot to a graphical user interface by default, because a lot of what I do, I can do faster on a command line, and it takes like 10 seconds to boot. But as mentioned, I'm also old, so I started using computers when they all had command line interfaces by default, and if you wanted to go to Windows, you had to type in a command to start it. Same with my systems. When I do need or want graphical applications or a desktop, it's a single command away. And no, I don't have all this memorized. I'm in fact terrible at memorization, so don't think that's a barrier either. You can always look up the commands on documentations or reference a forum post if you've forgotten what you needed to do. But these days you never need to venture into the terminal unless you're specifically using a terminal-focused distro like Arch or Endeavour. But these shouldn't be in the conversation for a first-time Linux user anyway. But as I said, this is not in any way unique to Linux. Learning PowerShell makes you a lot more effective a Windows user, and fiddling with your dot files on macOS can make the user experience a lot more satisfying on those systems as well. Nobody is expected to know how to use them or even know that they exist. Same is true these days for Linux. Number 6. You need to be a coder. I'd say I'm a perfectly average low to intermediate Linux user, and I don't know how to code anything except for some basic and HTML. I have coded in Linux, but I've never coded for Linux, and I've never felt the need to. A lot of coders do use Linux because the level of control it gives to your system means that coders and other low-level system operators can really do the maximum for the buck in these systems. I think this might be one of the reasons why Linux has this reputation, but it really is not required. Exactly how having a MacBook isn't necessary for you to be a massive douche, but it sure does complete the look. Number 7. Leave the elitism for the elites. I use Arch, by the way. Another thing I hear new Linux users struggle with is somehow feeling bad about not using certain distros over some others, especially mentioning Arch Linux as this Linux final boss everyone should strive towards achieving. This is much the fault of us, the Linux users. There is so much elitism in the community, and it absolutely drives me up the walls. So indeed, you advanced users, you're also doing it wrong. Trademark. Now, yes, I myself do run Arch Linux, but that's because it's not actually hard to install. Arguably, it's easier to maintain than a lot of other systems, and it's really convenient because the repos have pretty much every piece of software the universe has spit out available. You just need to install it from the repos or the AUR. Apparently, it's easier to break, and the rolling release makes it unstable, but after 3 years of daily driving it, it hasn't failed on me yet. But if you don't want to use Arch, and if you find it intimidating, that's fine. As covered earlier, the distro you pick matters far less than you think. Especially since 90% of what we do in our computer happens in the browser these days anyway, so who cares? And if you do have a workload that requires a specific distro, again, you are not the focus of this video, and you are not someone who is trying Linux. So, while I do maintain that it is Linux community's fault that this perception is out there, I do want to highlight a clip from a video that I otherwise really liked to point out a very common sentiment I hear in these videos.
I have never touched a Linux topic in my life. Why? Because you guys scare the shit out of me, because you guys are some opinionated mother...
Dude, have you met gamers? I know you have. Linux people have nothing compared to the hardcore gamers out there who go as far as death threats if their favorite franchise's female lead isn't sexy enough to their taste. Last I heard, nobody's gotten swatted for not reading the effing manual. But there is a point here. Running Arch or Gentoo doesn't make you special hackery data crunch mega specialist. It just means that you know how to install Arch or Gentoo. And that is cool. But at the end of the day, you just follow instructions. So yeah, don't fall into the trap of going all elitist in your ability to run a more advanced distro or even Linux from scratch. So let's leave this term for the true elites, the owner class that run society and hog all the wealth, leaving the world to burn, and, the underclasses to quabble with each other over the scraps to survive. Wait, where was I? My point being, if you're happy with the distro you have, you do not have to strive for another one, even if it is Arch Linux. By the way, number 8. It's okay if Linux is not for you. Here's more gentleness for you. If you try out Linux and you don't get along with it, it's fine. You don't have to use Linux and you don't need to apologize for it. Windows might be the thing you need, even if you dislike a lot of things about it. That's fine. There's a lot of aspects about Linux that I don't like. No system is perfect, even if I do get to customize my system a lot more than you do yours. And here's my dirty little secret. I actually run other operating systems as well. Currently, I double boot my computer between Linux and FreeBSD. I run older versions of Windows on virtual machines. Granted, I haven't needed or wanted to boot into Windows instances for so long that I don't even know how old the major revision installed is, but I still have it when I need to run a peripheral that doesn't have drivers or play one of the rare games that don't work with Proton. I also run a Mac for my audio software stuff, mainly the plugins that only work in proprietary operating systems, because I really want to avoid Windows 11 as much as I can for the aforementioned privacy and data security problems. Also, it is nigh unusable these days with how many core features they've removed from the system over time. But operating systems are tools. And as Scotty said,
how many times do I have to tell you the right tool for the right job?
Just be aware that if you ignore modern Linux, you are ignoring a major tool in your arsenal. And yes, I do edit and post-produce these videos in Linux without any problems. I've also noticed that a lot of people don't realize that they're already using Linux very successfully. If you have one of these and it runs Android, you are daily driving Linux as your main operating system without any issue. And yes, I know some will point out that it's not Linux, it's a wrapper running over the Linux kernel, but Linux is the kernel. That's what it means. So you are running Linux. Also notable are comments like these.
What about gaming? I'm not an avid gamer, but I do play from time to time, mostly on my Steam Deck.
Yeah. If you didn't know, the Steam Deck runs Linux. People just don't realize it. If that doesn't tell you how mature gaming support on Linux is, I don't know what does. And by the way, she's done my favorite Linux trial videos by far, even if she does fall into some of the things highlighted here. And that's okay. Number 9. As I said, I won't mention any videos or use clips unless I have positive things to say about them. With the exception of the Linux Tech Tips videos that I'm convinced were rage bait because it is simply not possible to be that clueless about what you're doing. Don't get drawn into the bait. But here we go. On to the highlighting of the good videos.
Because Linux is full power. Most like Arch and all that, you can go in there and really mess things up. But you make more money on the sell of the data, which means they should just make Windows free at this point. So you're paying to be spied on. So I think if you're someone that's like, I want to mess around in Linux, I want to get my feet kind of like dip my toes in, but I don't want to be overwhelmed, I feel like Bazai is a really good way to start.
I'm so excited to get started using Linux on my computer.
What is it? This shirt came in the mail pre-installed with vinegar. They're like they knew you were gonna be stinky.
Linux Gamer install. No stinking way, dude. Hold on. So I just type Discord and it just opens?
I gave up.
but I'm ungiving up. Just freaking pretend you're in the Matrix, bro.
But in my mind, Linux has just been a disease you contract staring at spreadsheets. Installing Windows 11 feels a little bit like being that old man in No Country for Old Men who has to flip a coin. But look at that! Is that like a Linux thing? That's crazy. Apparently it's not a Linux thing. It does feel very good. I mean, we're actually getting 100% GPU utilization apparently.
But there was one last hope for it, and that's with Linux.
I've been using Linux for the past month now, and honestly, it's sort of awesome.
Just pick the one that's good for your needs. Wow, thanks. If I knew which one was good for me, I would have installed it already. And then if I press Alt and space, boom, my U launcher pops up.
The power of sudo compels you. I've been told that screen recorder is a good screen recorder. Wow, is there anything people can't do? All right, beautiful. Open your terminal. I thought I got rid of your terminal. I've accidentally just created the nuclear symbol there. Well, that does also happen to Linux every now and then.